people still joining, but I would propose to get started. A lot to discuss in 1 hour. Thanks again for joining. This is the second Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism webinar we are hosting from PwC Global. We're here with 4 colleagues. They will introduce themselves as we go along. And maybe Jonathan, you can go to the next slide to see what we're proposing to do today. We'll start off with a quick recap. What is CBAM again, and what has changed over the past couple of months since we last spoke? Then we'll go into some burning questions. Obviously, if you have other questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We'll try to either pick them up as we go along, or if we don't have time, we'll come back to your questions. Then we'll focus on some next steps. Obviously, we're only 3 weeks away from the transitional period starting. That's 1 October. It's actually a Sunday, so probably you will be looking out for 2 October, but that's a minor detail. And then if we have some time left, we can pick up your questions and we'll have some conclusions. In the meantime, a couple of things. Please mute your microphone. The questions can be submitted through the chat functions. And we'll be recording this session, and it will also be made available online. So if you need to drop off at a certain stage, you can watch the remainder if you are available again. I think that's it for the moment, and let's start off with the recap. Claudia, you want to take us through?
Yes. Good morning. My name is Claudia. I'm responsible for the Dutch Customs and International Trade Practice, and I'm also similar to Niels, who didn't do his own introduction, but together we are part of the Center of Excellence of the Green Deal. If we go to the next slide, Jonathan, then here you can see the timeline. A lot of it is already in the past, but I think there's already also a lot that we are looking forward to. In December, there was at least a clear indication that CBAM actually would happen, and that the point of no return actually was behind us. In April, the formal decision was taken that CBAM indeed, everyone approved the regulation, and that meant that we knew it was going to happen. And then in May, they actually published it in the official journal of the EU. And that means that as of that date, it's formal law. And it also states that it will enter into force as of October this year, 2023, which is on quite short notice. In June, the Commission actually published some draft implementing regulations. There was the opportunity for you and for all of us to provide some feedback. We as PwC, based on conversations that we had with our clients, but also because of our own review, did some or filed a response. If you look at the final draft or the final implementing regulation, how it was published in August, it's, I think, a lot alike the draft implementing regulation. The Commission also only had 1 month, so it was not likely that a lot would change. However, what they did do in August, as said, they published the draft implementing regulation. That is an official law, so that means you're bound by it. They also published 2 quite extensive guidance documents, one for importers and one for producers. Importers is only 100 pages, so that is doable. For if you are a producer, it are 300 pages of guidance documents. It's good to take into account that the guidance documents is guidance, so it's there to give you a direction on how to read the law, but it is not law. So if you strongly feel that the law is saying something different than the guidance documents, then the law always prevails. So keep that in mind when you are confused that the law prevails. As of the 1st of October, as Niels already said, it is only 3 weeks away and 1 day then, because then we are on Monday again. Then it will kick in the CBAM obligations. The first 3 months, it will mainly be nothing that you have to do, because automatically your declaration, if you import products with the HS code that is mentioned in the CBAM legislation, you have to do something with it, but that's only in January 2026 when you have to file the formal report to the Commission. Because the Commission already said they are going to create a system, but we haven't seen it yet, so we are waiting what will happen there. And then as of January 2026, the payment also will start, which means that you have to buy certificates upfront to cover your CBAM imports, and that then the reporting will no longer be on a quarterly basis, but on a yearly basis. The idea is that since the EU ETS allowances are being phased out, that as of 2043, that it will actually that it will apply in full. So if we then go to the next slide, just as some kind of guidance, it's a very simplified CBAM decision tree. If you're wondering what should I be doing today, I think it is good to check whether your goods are in scope of CBAM. We don't know it from all the member states, but if you're importing in the Netherlands, the customs did a similar check and they sent you a letter about it, that likely you will be in scope of CBAM. If you received such a letter, certainly go further with the box yes. If you are not in the Netherlands and if you did not not importing in the Netherlands and you did not receive a similar letter, please do the check based on the HS code whether your products will be in scope. If you're reviewing, some of you may be outside of the EU and the in-house HS classification might be based, for instance, on US classification rules, although it should be more or less similar. Please be aware the EU is only looking at EU classification. So if you decided, or if your products are currently not in scope of CBAM, then you have a no, and for the time being you are okay. However, as said, likely it will, as soon as ETS will be reduced further, additional products may be brought into scope, and then potentially you need to review it on a regular basis. If your products are indeed in scope of CBAM, then you have to determine the embedded emissions per product. The EU have set various standards, but I think we will discuss that later. What is important now to understand is you have to calculate the embedded emissions, and as a general rule, you have to know the actuals for 80%, because the default values that will be made available, that can only be used for 20% of the total amount of products. Then the question is, are you a producer? Then it's really relevant, because then you come to the no. Likely the importer into the EU will ask you quite some detailed information to be able to calculate the embedded emissions. If it is yes, if you are the one importing in the EU, then you have to file declarations for CBAM purposes, and that needs to be done on a quarterly basis. The first one is due in January 2024. You need to file in January 2024. However, if you made some errors, there's still the opportunity to repair that a month later. So if we then go to the next slide, then that's really about reporting. So are you a authorized CBAM declarant? You can be one if you are established in the EU. So if you are not established in the EU and you use a broker that in that scenario will be your indirect representative, then that broker needs to file the declaration on your behalf. That will be quite challenging for the brokers, so it might be worth to look whether you can maybe impose a subsidiary company to take that obligation. But also be aware that you need to help your broker if they are filing the import declarations on your behalf. What is important as a first step is to get insights in all the imports actually performed in the specific quarter. Because I already received a question from one of my clients who said, yeah, I know what I order, but what you order is not necessarily what you also import. So please have a good conversation with your broker to make sure that you get report from the broker. As said, you have to do it for each quarter based on the HS code, but also, as mentioned on the right side in the middle, for each supplier. So if you have a product that is coming from two different suppliers, you have to make the report per HS code per supplier. And then you have to report the direct and the indirect emissions. You also have to provide information on the country of origin and on the installation of the last production location. The Commission also clearly mentioned in the introduction of the legislation that they are on a learning path together with you during this transition phase, and that is likely why they also ask, please provide us the carbon price paid. In the future, you will mention that by default, because then you will have a reduction on what you're actually paying, but at the moment, that's of course not the idea, but yeah, it is going to provide useful insights to the Commission if you work along with them. So if we then go to the next slide, then I will continue talking for a short while, but after that I will hand it over to Alexis and Oliver, who will introduce themselves in a bit more detail when they start with their piece. So what we thought is it is good to guide you through some burning questions that we receive, and they of course relate to the supply chain. So what we did, we drafted a sample supply chain. So first we have and we broke it up in 3 categories basically. First you have the non-EU suppliers, the mine in Australia and the melter in Vietnam. They don't have anything in Europe, but they have the products that they produce, what they are going to supply to either category 2, the EU factory, or number 3, the non-EU trader /import or final product. That is why for them it's really relevant, because they are the ones that 2 and 3 basically need to be able to file a CBAM report. So the first category is the non-EU suppliers. The second category is the EU factory. In the EU factory, they receive steel rods from the Vietnamese melter and processes these into bolts. So that is important. And the the US factory here, group 3, they use, as you can see, a customs broker for the declaration, but they also receive from the Vietnamese melter the steel rods, and they make them into screws. And the screws then will be imported into the EU and supplied to the EU retailer. Where you see the tick the box signs, that is where a CBAM declaration, or actually where the products enter the EU, and as such you have a responsibility for CBAM. That is what the tick the box sign is showing. And then if we go to the next slide, then Alexis will guide you through the burning questions for the non-EU suppliers.
Thank you, Claudia. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Alexis, and I'm based in Brussels. I'm leading the tax sustainability practice in Belgium. So indeed, I will focus on the first category about the non-EU supplier, and we listed a number of burning questions. And the first one is actually not that complex, I believe, is who is responsible for CBAM? And Claudia, in the intro or in the recap from the first webinar, actually already provided some inputs on that, but let's go a bit in more details, because that's the purpose of today, is we go a bit more in details compared to the first event we hosted. When I mean, what do I mean when responsible for CBAM is who is the authorized declarant? And the term declarant is actually essential, because the company who is the declarant is in the end the company liable towards the competent authorities, and responsible for the whole compliance process to the CBAM regulation. So to answer this first question, let's step back a minute to what the regulations say. The regulations define an authorized declarant with 3 key items. So is the importer who lodges a customs declaration for free circulation of goods in the EU in its own name, in its own behalf. So this is pretty well known from specialists. So is the importer, or basically the indirect representatives, the customs brokers, if you are using, or if you give a proxy to another person who hold the authorization to lodge a customs declaration. So this is the 3 cases where we may have a customs declarant. Now, if we apply this definition to this case study, and I hope you can still see on the top right the small chart, but clearly it seems that the mine in Australia would never be an authorized declarant because there is no import of CBAM goods into the EU. However, if you are today part of the audience and you are not located in the EU, well, the smelter in Vietnam could be an authorized declarant. So this is something you have to check and pay attention on that party in the value chain. And depending on their specific trade flows, well, this company could be a declarant. Let's move to the second question. And the question is, how do I calculate the embedded emissions of my CBAM goods? Well, this is one of the most difficult questions because Claudia already in the intro referred the number of guidance documents and the number of pages actually they are. So it is a pretty complex to undertake is in terms of analysis, and there are several reasons, I believe. Well, first, the regulation is complex. Second, there are some variances between different methodologies, and I will explain that in a minute. And third, companies lack data points. This is something we also have to recognize. So like the first question, let me share what the regulation says. And then in a second step, I will try to go back to the case study and try to be down to earth. So during the first year of implementation, so during this transition period, so the last quarter of 23 and the whole year of 24, the regulations say that you have 3 ways for your reporting. The first one is you apply the EU method. So basically the methodology that is contained in the guidance document. B is basically, the second one is the reporting methodology based on an equivalent third country national systems. If there is an approved methodology from another country by the EU, this can be also a basis. And the third one is the reference values or the default values that already Claudia mentioned that there is a cap of 20% on that. I will come back in a minute on that. But let's focus a minute on this EU method because we receive a lot of questions on this EU method. So mid-August, the European Commission released a lengthy guidance document. Claudia mentioned 100 pages, 300 pages. And these documents contain several methodologies. One methodology to calculate the greenhouse gas emissions contained in each product subject to the CBAM. Now, I'm using the term greenhouse gas emissions because for cement, hydrogen, electricity, iron, I think steel as well, we look at CO2 only, while if you go for aluminium, fertilizers, actually the scope is broader than CO2. Now, the EU method, so the first in the 3 methods I explained, the first one, the EU method, focuses on the stationary emissions, meaning the purpose is to track and report the emissions that are directly linked to the production process of a product subject to the CBAM. Well, easy said, not easy done. So now it's my turn to be a bit more, maybe more down to earth. And what did we experience over the last month and weeks actually when we go through this documents? Well, a number of observations. First, if a company is already subject to the EU ETS, we see that some companies have already developed some in-house process to forecast, monitor those greenhouse gas emissions. And we see that When you are under EU ETS, some companies already have a data set where they can rely on, and this is really useful. So if you are working in a company subject to the EU ETS, go and double check what is in those files. The second observation is that many companies have already started to analyze their carbon footprint. And this is where we observe some gaps between sometimes best-in-class carbon footprint analysis and the EU method. What is for sure is that it is a data-driven exercise. But let's take a simple example. If you have one electric meter in the plant, how do you isolate the electricity used for the production process and the electricity used for the coffee machine, right? Actually, if you go to the EU method, you simply need to disregard the electricity for the coffee machine, because as I said, you need to look at what is the greenhouse gas emissions for your production process. While if you go for a carbon footprint reporting, well, you will see some allocations made because the purpose is to have the carbon footprint of the entire manufacturing site. So this is something that you see a gaps between the EU and your own carbon footprint. But the good idea and some tips here is look at your Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions report if you have those, because sometimes it contains really useful information and it can be a starting point to answer the question number 2 on this slide. The third observation is you cannot fully rely on the reference values, the default values. Claudia explained that there is a tolerance at the beginning, but later you know that there will be a cap up to 20% of the emissions generated by using the default values. And on top of that, the default values are actually pretty negative because it's a benchmark of the worst players in the industry. So it's actually not a good idea to rely too much on those default values. But we have to also recognize the merit of the default values because they can play an important role, in particular in the first quarters, where you don't know all the data points. And that's why the EU also allow this third methodology about the reference values. But again, only the EU method will be accepted over the long run. So meaning you need to be ready. The second question the second leg of the question is, what is the information is unknown to me, and do you need to share it with your customers? So I will bundle the third questions together. Well, if you go back to the smelter on the case, I'm pretty sure that if we take that example, the smelter located in Vietnam will receive requests from its EU-based customers. And this will mainly be a commercial discussion. You will need to check the agreement. That will be a kind of the first step I would take it. Sometimes you have defined what is confidential information. So you need to see, is it in the scope? Do your customers have the right to ask this? Can your customers audit you? Because in the end, it's also, you will rely on data provided by a third party, because here in this context is a third party. So what is the actually in terms of liability management? Can you, for instance, say if there is an issue with the data that you can actually go back to your suppliers and say, no, you provide me with wrong information. So first step is to really look at your contracts and having the commercial discussion. For sure, the fact that there is a new regulation impacting actually many industries, I believe that actually the entire transparency or the transparency in the value chain will simply be higher and higher. And all companies will need to be ready with solid documentation trail, with the right data for customers, for suppliers. And actually, we expect that in the end, when it's very mature, it will be part of the product regulation. Think about the food you buy in the supermarket. As a consumer, you almost know everything about the ingredients and traceability of the ingredients. Actually, if I'm taking a bit the parallel with the CBAM, well, we can expect that over the long run, this might be broadly similar in a B2B context. Now, the second aspect I would like to share is that there is this transitional period, and companies need to do the efforts during the transitional period. And what do I mean with that? I mentioned about the gaps between the EU method and some greenhouse gas protocols. But this period is actually ideal to share intelligence with the European Commission. And it's a good momentum because you will not have 3 opportunities to share that. It is now in the transitional period that if you believe that your methodology is in line with the law, but not fully in line, or there are some gaps with the EU method, well, it's maybe a good idea to start sharing that with the European Commission. And by the way, the European Commission is willing to listen to industry players to know more. So this is something you will have to do a number of positive steps towards the European Commission in order to impact positively the regulation. So clearly, it's also good to see that a number of clarification requests are being prepared. I focus on the non-EU supplier, and I leave the word now to and I handle to Oli, who will further look at the second category. Oli, floor is yours.
Thank you, Alexis, and also welcome from my side. My name is Oliver. I'm a director in the Swiss Customs and Trade Practice, and also care about sustainability topics here in Switzerland. So let's have a look at the situation for the EU-based factory, which will import goods into the EU. Also here we ask the question, who is responsible for CBAM? We've heard it before from Alexis, the definition. The authorized CBAM declarant is basically the importer who also lodges the customs declaration when the goods are imported into the EU. So if you apply this to this situation, it's likely the EU-based factory one that will need to act as authorized CBAM declarant and also comply with the upcoming CBAM regulation. A hot burning question that we often hear is, what happens if my suppliers do not want or cannot provide me with the data which I need in order to do this CBAM reporting? I think it's important to understand that in the CBAM regulation itself, there is no legal mechanism so that you can use to compel a supplier to provide you with the required CBAM information. So as such, we just expect the obligation to provide timely, verifiable emission data to become a key component of the tender and contracting process. So when you purchase the goods from the suppliers. If suppliers are unable or don't want to provide the customers with the required information, we would expect the customers, so the importers basically, to go elsewhere over the time. I think it's also worth mentioning that the CBAM will eventually include a credit for carbon taxes paid domestically by a supplier. However, this domestic tax does not remove the obligation to report on CBAM, and it is unlikely to apply, so that certain jurisdictions do not need to provide the information. Also an interesting question, what happens if I import the goods? Do I have any additional payments, such as CBAM levies, charges, or other taxes that apply in connection with CBAM that I have to pay to the customs authorities? For now, there's nothing additional to be added or to be paid. We've heard it before, the full CBAM will start 1st January 2026. And there it will have a price component with every CBAM certificate being equal to 1 ton of embedded CO2 emissions, which are priced at the average weekly price of the EU ETS. The EU ETS is currently traded around 90 to 100 euros per allowance, but we would expect this to be increased by 1st January 2026. So in a nutshell, you don't have to expect any payments at the time of importation of the goods into the EU. So that was basically the situation for the EU-located factory. Now let's have a look at, on the next slide, for a business, the trading company, which is established in the EU. So there's no EU establishment for this business here in this specific scenario. So who is responsible for CBAM now? Again, it is the CBAM declarant that generally imports the goods into the EU and lodges the customs declaration. In this scenario, it is the US-based factory 2 that uses a customs broker to manage the importation of their goods into the EU. And after what we've heard from Alexis just before, the US factory approached the customs broker to do that, and they agreed that they would take the obligation of lodging the CBAM report as the authorized CBAM declarant. Importantly, albeit Factory 1 is no longer required to lodge the CBAM report, they will still need to determine the embedded emissions of their products and provide this information to the customs broker so that they can draft the reports and file it with the responsible authority. What information do I need to provide to the broker or the authorized CBAM declarant for the CBAM report then? You have to report the following information that needs to be included in the CBAM report. The first thing is the total quantity of each type of goods expressed in megawatt hours for the electricity that you import, or in tons for other goods specified per installation producing the goods in the country of origin. That's the first bullet. Then the second information you have to provide is the actual total embedded emissions expressed in tons of CO2 equivalent emissions per megawatt hour of electricity. And for other goods, it is again in tons of CO2 emissions per ton of each type of good. So that's the second information you have to provide. Then the third one is the total indirect emissions, including amount of electricity consumed. We heard an example from Alexis before, and the applicable emissions factor. And then lastly, the carbon price due in the country of origin for the embedded emissions that are embedded in the imported goods, taking into account relevant rebates or other forms of compensation in the country of origin. So these are basically the information that you will need to provide and file it with the authorities in the report. It's also important to understand that under each of these headings that I just mentioned, there is a detailed product and installation level information required. Then a question that, to close this slide, that we also often hear from clients, is there a penalty if I don't provide the information which is requested according to the CBAM regulation? Yes, there is the possibility of penalties for non-compliance. However, the European Commission has acknowledged that the transitional period is designed to be the learning period for all stakeholders. So therefore, businesses that are impacted by the CBAM should prepare themselves for the obligation of the CBAM report. And we do not expect to see penalties for the first few reports unless you didn't do any attempts to have been compliant with the CBAM regulation. So with that, basically, we close this part of the supply chain samples, and I want to hand over back to Alexis, who will guide us now through the next steps, what you have to consider. So Alexis, thank you.
Thank you, Oli. And it's good to see already a number of questions popping up. Please continue. If we have time in the end, we will for sure respond to a few of them or revert after the webinar. So let's move to the impact the CBAM has on the business. And actually, CBAM has a pretty profound impact and more than we can thought, because, and my key message to you today is that we can, of course, look at CBAM in a simple levy, like a simple customs duty. But the biggest difference is that the levy is not based on the customs value, but on the greenhouse gas emissions. And for some goods, if you already have a low gross or net margin, if you look at the CBAM combined with other EU measures like ETS2 or ETS transportation, road, maritime, and so on, actually this can have a significant financial impact. So really, you also need to see where those additional levies and contributions tax, even though the European Commission say we cannot talk about tax because this is not a tax measure. Well, clearly you need to quantify this, and I will come back in a minute on that. But it's important for companies to identify their pressure points and map their stakeholders, because both exercise should ideally conclude to a roadmap. And this is where most of companies and organizations we are talking to actually look at simply how to organize this. On this slide, we listed a number of pressure points. I will not comment in detail all of them. But of course, as from 26, there is a CBAM certificates cost. You need to buy as a company the certificates to import. But think about the working capital. You need to pre-finance the certificates because afterwards you surrender at the same price. So there is no more capital gain or capital loss to consider from a corporate income tax perspective, but clearly from a treasury perspective, from a working capital, you need to pre-finance that. So if you are in a company where liquidity is low and you already are struggling with with low liquidity, higher interest rate, working capital can be for some companies a very important topic. Another one, for example, is the cost of compliance. Sometimes for very low tax, you need to have usine à gaz and basically have a lot of data to consider, and the cost of compliance can actually be sometimes more expensive than the tax itself. So this is something, where do you position that cost? Commercial, I talked a bit earlier about the legal aspects. Huh? So it's also the fact that you need to screen your contracts, your commercial contracts, and how you want to make sure that your contracts are sustainable from a business perspective. Oli just mentioned risks, so I will not go there, but maybe the last one is about the data. From our perspective, it's also a low-hanging fruit that if your company is already in the process of digitalization, change of ERP, transformation of a finance process, it can be also a good idea to add a CBAM process in this finance transformation. This is a low-hanging fruit, easy said, not easy. It is easy done, of course. Now, regarding your stakeholders, I observe now kind of a hot potato game in many organizations because everybody is talking about CBAM, but it's not always easy who will actually be accountable for CBAM internally. And this is also a very important one, because if you look at the regulation of CBAM, per definition, you need a task force. You need a kind of steering committee where you have different managers and executives present there in order for the management to balance different objectives. From our perspective, compliance is not per se a topic for discussion. As a company, you need to comply with the law. It's a given, it's a no-brainer. So making sure that you need to comply, it's a no discussion. However, who is accountable and who is actually driving the process behind, this is actually, we observe that the process still needs to be designed in many organizations. So this is an important one, and we listed on this slide a number of stakeholders. There are maybe others depending of your business, your industry, maybe if you have some regional management as well. We observe that some companies simply say, well, it's the EMEA region who is looking at this because it is in the end a EU levy. Or if there is no regional management, well, you need to manage this from overseas, outside the EU, which can be difficult. I put procurement in the first one because, of course, Oli, Claudia, and myself, we discuss about one of the first items you need to contact with your suppliers to ask for data. Well, if you look on process, when we talk about supplier relationship management, typically this is a relationship that is handled by your procurement organization. So make sure that your procurement teams can also add this to the checklist and action points. So as a good example. The last piece I wanted to make there is, of course, the example we give you with the case study today, it was between third parties. It might be more challenging to get data from a third-party supplier. If you contract on an intra-group basis between related parties, well, if you have a toll manufacturer or contract manufacturer in Asia or in the US importing goods, well, actually, normally you are part of the same group. Access to data should be more easy. Well, again, easy said, not easily done, because most of what we observe is that even though you are part of the same group, maybe the pressure on the legal side is lower because there is no external liability or third-party risk. However, it might not be easy also for your related party contract manufacturer in Asia or in the US, for instance, to provide you with the data you need in the EU for CBAM. So clearly, this is something to consider, and it is clearly the time now to see working on CBAM more in a project mode. If we can go to the next slide. On this slide, we actually pitch or sketch a kind of typical way we see many companies are dealing with CBAM. But let me be down to earth again. As an organization, the first thing you want to know is how much money is at stake. Are we talking about 25,000 euro or a few millions per year? This will impact the next of your roadmap. The energy, the resource, the time, the budget, and so on will depend on this criterion, how material it is. So our first advice to all of you is to quantify the CBAM first. And for this step, you will need to decide on the greenhouse gas intensity. If you have the exact value in line with the methodology, wow, good job, well done, you can quantify. You can use estimates, you can default values, you can do worst case scenario. Well, my point to you is today you need to quantify. Again, are we talking about 25,000 or a few millions? It will impact your roadmap. I invite you to consult, because if you combine a number of data, sometimes simply looking at the quantity, you may think, okay, even though you put an extreme value, it will be low. So, you know, we have developed some tools, dashboards, which are very pragmatic to facilitate your decisions. Maybe no need to reinvent the wheel. My point is consult. But depending on the materiality, and that's maybe the most important step in terms of where to go, right or left. If you see that you have a low materiality, well, your challenge will be, I need to manage the whole compliance process. But for sure, if it's not material, you will not look at alternatives. But if it's a material topic, you will need to consider different options. Do you need, for instance, more resource? Do you need to hire people to manage that process? Do you need maybe to change a flow? Is there an option? Can you change a warehouse roadmap? Do you need to move this warehouse in a bonded status because you see that there is a flow that will leave the EU afterwards? So if this is material, you clearly need to be much more open-minded and your roadmap will look very different. There is, of course, no one-size-fits-all solution. And I would even say, depending on where you are on your digitalization, your roadmap can look actually pretty different. If you are very mature in terms of data, you can take control and full control, while if you are less mature, you will be more dependent on the other parties. This will also impact the way you interact with your suppliers and customers. Looking at the clock, I leave the final words to Niels, and then we can go to the Q&A, I guess. Niels.
Yes, thanks, Alexis. Very clear, and it's clear that CBAM is much more than just a compliance exercise. And in terms of financial impact, even if the financial impact is assumed to be limited for the coming years, you see that ETS prices are on the rise, and obviously free rides are being taken out of the market. So your impact in 26 may be really different from 2030. So I think that's also very good to take those scenarios into account. I saw we received quite a few questions, so maybe good just to dive in those and see how much we can get answered in the last, let's say 10-15 minutes of this presentation. And if I go to the questions, one of the questions was on the scope 3 emissions. Are they part of the indirect emissions? And maybe Claudia, that's something for you to pick up.
I think this is more Ollie's area.
Ollie, you want to pick that up?
So if I may, the scope 3 you report, you don't have to consider it. However, in your scope 2 and scope 1, you have a number of indirect emissions. And here you need to be careful about what is the indirect emissions in a greenhouse gas and carbon footprint versus what is defined as indirect emissions. So if you look at the emissions coverage during the transitional period, for instance, for electricity in the regulation, we only consider direct emissions, but for cement, fertilizers, and others, we also look at indirect. There is clearly, so clearly the scope 3 report don't pay too much attention. I only mentioned Scope 1 and Scope 2 reports where there is a source of data that can be relevant. Scope 3, less relevant for this exercise. But again, part of this gap analysis, you need to make sure that what the EU calls direct and indirect, that there is a full match. So this is a step to be done in your specific case, specific product.
Yeah. And Ollie, I think there's indeed some default values you can use in the intermediate period. I think Joost was asking about that. Is that something you want to comment on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is the opportunity to use default values for a certain period of time, if I'm not mistaken, I think until mid of next year. But the idea is clearly, and that's also what the Commission stated, that importers are basically asked to gain effective information, effective emission data from the suppliers, and not rely too much on default values. Because based on that, the idea is then to define the default values also for the future.
Yeah, and maybe I think Edwin's question is related to that. How do you actually report these GHG emissions? Do you need them to report them as a ton of CO2 equivalent?
Yeah, the regulation basically states that ton of CO2 equivalent means 1 metric ton of CO2. So basically, if I understand that correctly, you have to report basically the metric tons of CO2. At least that's what has to be stated in the reports.
Yeah. I think the question of Roy is also related there. So what kind of allocation method is acknowledged? You want to quickly say something about that as well? So Roy is asking about
it is really specific for per product. So yeah, so it's difficult to answer in a generic way, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think the general answer is that the Commission is also still trying to figure out what the most appropriate way is. So I think that's where the transitional period is for.
And Niels, if I may also comment on the question for the metrics that Ollie responded. I think it's also something important for all people today to, in the reporting, in the CBAM the return, I would say, what you need to report in terms of metrics is the ton of good. So except for electricity, which is megawatt per hour. But of course, to make the calculation behind, you need what Ollie said. So, but what you put in the return is the ton of good and megawatt for electricity. That's the reporting metrics. But again, you see that there are a number of items that we need to pay attention, because what you need and what you report is different.
Yeah. And I think Diana was asking where she can find the default values for reporting. Is that something maybe Claudia you want to comment on? Where are these?
Yeah, they will be made available and be published by the EU Commission. So the methodology is already described, but the actual values will be published by the Commission. So that is something to monitoring closely. So that is, and I think that is also directly, I'm getting some of the grass in front of your feet, we would say in proper Dutch, is about that Nick mentioned. The idea is clear, but in practice, it's still a bit vague what is expected from us. And I think Nick describes the feeling that likely the majority of the audience will feel. And I think that is a bit what we all experience. So also that's the case for us. And also even the Commission mentioned it in their introduction, right, to the legislation. We are building the bridge while walking on it. And I think that is also one of the important messages that we want to bring across. The fact that it's unclear could result in two things. One is we freeze and we don't do anything and we hope that we get clarity and then are still in time. Or we are trying to help building the bridge. And that means that indeed the system is not yet live. So we are also awaiting the system. We don't know how it will look like, whether it's something similar to the customs declaration system, or whether it is you have an Excel and you can just upload it. And that's basically the system. We don't know how developed the system will be. But I think what is important to also the point that Alexis made previously, try verify what you already have on information. So liaise with your brokers already. Can you get the report? Do you then know, because that is quite clear information, do you then already know where the production facility is, or first, who's the supplier? What is the production facility? Do you have the country of origin right? That is something that is general information that you could have available in time. The emission process, how to calculate that, that is the more challenging part. And there, indeed, we are rating a system. And but that is also there, the Commission is quite well aware. You have the EU method as described previously. Then you have two basically alternative methods. And the first one for the first 9 months is file whatever you have, try to give the best of your abilities, and we are really and then the Commission is already quite happy. But the first three are something that is really mandatory: HS classification, who is the supplier, what is the operation site, and what is the country of origin. That is something you should be able to know and to complete in the report.
Yeah, and I think then one of the no regret actions is to figure out whether you are importing these goods, who's responsible within your organization. There's quite a few things you can do. The Commission is also hosting a number of seminars for industry parties to discuss per product category how they think this will go forward. But so far they haven't been very prescriptive on the IT system and how it will really look like. So I think in terms of getting ready, it's up to the market parties themselves to sort of inform themselves and make sure they're ready. I see one question there on the long list of info to be included in the CBAM report. Ollie, do you want to say something there on how you think the CBAM report would look like, and what is there a template or?
There is basically like a template that you can use. I think it was published by the EU Commission on their webpage. That you can. It's an Excel sheet, quite complex. So if you look at it, but this is something that you can use and share with the suppliers. When it comes to the level of detail on what has to be included in the report, I have to refer to Appendix 1 of the implementing regulation. There you can basically see all the data points and information you require from your suppliers. So that's also what you then need basically when the CBAM becomes fully operational, because this information will then be relevant to be shared with the verifiers before that you can finally submit the declaration to the authorities.
Yeah. And maybe one thing, and I think Alexis, you also referred to that for any new contract you sign, probably good to get a few clauses in there that would allow you to ask for this information, right? I think for existing contracts it might be difficult, or it might be you require some legal analysis whether you are actually able to retrieve the information. But if you sign a new contract, get a few clauses in that would allow you to obtain this information.
But also, Niels, on this point, it's of course, if it's new contract, it's a kind of no-brainer. But we see as a best practice that procurement teams have actually a calendar of contracts that will be renewed. And sometimes with big suppliers, negotiation can take multiple years sometimes. So maybe your procurement teams are actually already busy with a number of renewal negotiation, and this is something that it needs to be spotted now, because maybe the renewal will only take place next year, but people are busy now. So it's good also to make a bit noise internally on that.
Yeah. I saw another question from, I think we haven't answered that one, from Ludwig, who's asking if he can already file a CBAM report for the period October-December. Can you file that before January? If somebody has an idea on that?
No, the idea is that it will really be quarterly report. So it will be different than a regular customs import declaration, which you file on a shipment by shipment base. The authorities clearly stated that they want to have a quarterly report, being all the imports in a certain period. If you already know by heart that there will be no subsequent imports after November, to be honest, I'm not 100% sure, but I expect that it will be similar, that your reporting period starts the 1st of January and it's not possible to file it in advance of the deadline that is set. But at least it needs to be quarterly and not be done on a shipment by shipment basis as it's done with customs declarations.
Okay, clear. I think we covered most of the questions. Not sure if somebody has a final thought on this. Otherwise, we'll start to wrap it up. So just looking around, seeing if there's somebody who has a...
Niels, I think there may be just one more question in respect
Yep.
to verification obligations during the transitional period.
All right.
So I think that was just from Anna. What is the obligation of the operators in regards to verification of the CO2 processes? And
yeah, Ollie, is that something you want to answer?
Yeah, I can start. Maybe Alexis can add. During the transitional period, at least, there is no verification process. So during the next 2 years, more or less, you just have to gather information and report it. But still, what you recommend, I mean, use this time to properly set it up and also implement a verification process that allows you to check whether the data that you receive from your suppliers are adequate. Because we know that 2 years will fly by very, very fast. So I think it's worth it already include or set up like a process that has a verification process in place already now. Verification will then be needed for sure as of 1st January 2026, because then we have the step in between that verifiers need to check the data. So we clearly recommend that before you file the data with the verifiers, you also have to have a kind of internal process where you can ensure that the data you receive from the suppliers are correct and adequate.
Yeah. And I see a final question popping in from Nick as well, especially on the price increase expected. I think it depends really what type of product you look at. So from steel, where we see rough indications of 10% increase, to fertilizer, which maybe even 20 or more. So it really depends on your specific product and also obviously on the specific supply chain you're using. So giving a real hard figure there is difficult, but it is a price increase. I think what is interesting to see as well is that in reaction to CBAM, there's quite a few other countries that are also considering some form of carbon pricing, which would then be a credit towards the CBAM system. So I think not so much CBAM alone, but carbon pricing in general is something to be really aware of. Even the US is thinking of a carbon border adjustment mechanism at the moment. So you see that lots of territories are moving towards some kind of system to pricing carbon. Is it a compensation to catch up rising prices in the EU? It's not meant to be that. If you see what the Commission says, it's a compensation for no carbon pricing outside the EU, and you see a lot of countries introducing similar measures now. So I think overall the message is look at your carbon. It will be priced somewhere. Yeah, and then thanks for joining. This was event 2. We'll be back once there is more information and some probably some practical experience with all of the CBAM reporting. Any questions? Feel free to reach out to your local PwC contact or one of us. And good to mention that the UK and the German firm are also hosting events to specifically look at challenges they see in their markets. So that's tomorrow for the UK and Germany on 18 September. And with that, I would thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Bye bye.